3 weeks after we buried my son, my daughter-in-law brought another man into our home and told me it was time I learned how to move on. I was standing at the kitchen sink when I heard the front door open. The sound of unfamiliar footsteps crossing the hardwood floors. Marcus had refinished himself just 5 summers ago. I dried my hands slowly, pressing the dish towel flat against my palms, and for a moment I told myself it was a neighbor, maybe someone bringing over another casserole I would never eat. But then I heard her laugh. Light, carefree, not the laugh of a grieving widow. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw a pair of men's loafers by the door. Brown leather. Size 11, maybe 12. Not my son's. Marcus wore a 10.5. I remember that because I bought his last pair of dress shoes for Easter service 2 years ago. Emily stood in the living room, one hand resting casually on the back of the couch, the other gesturing toward the family photographs lined across the mantel. The man beside her, tall, neatly dressed, polite-looking, gave me a tight smile, as if he understood he was standing somewhere sacred and wasn't quite sure where to place his eyes. Gloria, Emily said, her voice smooth, almost rehearsed. This is Ryan. He's a friend. I hope that's not a problem. A problem. I looked past her to the framed picture of Marcus in his Navy graduation gown, the one taken at Howard University when he was 22 and so proud he could barely keep still for the camera. The house still smelled faintly of the lilies from his memorial service. I had not yet packed away his jackets. His coffee mug was still in the cabinet, the blue one with the chipped handle he refused to throw out. I folded the dish towel over my arm and walked fully into the room. A friend, I repeated, tasting the word carefully. Ryan nodded. Ma'am, he said softly. Respectful. Uncomfortable. He was not the one I was angry with. I wasn't angry at all. Not yet. What I felt was something colder. Something steady. Emily crossed her arms, defensive before I had even spoken. Marcus is gone, she said. I'm still here. I can't live like a ghost in this house forever. The house. Not our home. Not the place where my husband and I raised our only child. Not the dining room, where Marcus blew out candles every July until he turned 40. Just a house. I studied her face. There were no tear stains. No tremble in her voice. Only impatience. And you expect me to what? I asked quietly. Pretend you don't see it, she replied. Stay out of it. You're strong, Gloria. You'll understand. I understood more than she realized. I understood that grief makes some people softer. It makes others restless. I understood that at 36, she did not plan to sit in black dresses for the rest of her life. But I also understood something else. Marcus's name was still on the deed. Marcus had insisted on certain arrangements after his diagnosis, arrangements he discussed with me one late night at this very kitchen table while Emily was away visiting her sister in Seattle. I looked at Ryan again. He shifted his weight, glancing toward the door as if calculating how quickly he could leave if asked. I almost pitied him. Almost. You should make yourself comfortable, Emily said, walking toward the kitchen as if she were hosting a Sunday brunch. We're all adults here. Adults. I nodded slowly. Yes, I said. We are. Then I turned back to the sink, picked up the same plate I had been washing, and continued scrubbing as if nothing had changed. The water ran warm over my hands. Steady. Controlled. Emily thought my silence meant surrender. She mistook my stillness for weakness. She forgot who taught Marcus how to be patient. She forgot whose name was written in places she had never thought to look. Ryan did not stay for dinner that first night, but he came back the next afternoon, and the afternoon after that, and by the end of the week his presence had settled into the corners of the house like a new piece of furniture no one had asked for, but everyone was expected to accept. I noticed the small changes first. An unfamiliar jacket draped over the back of a dining chair. A different brand of coffee in the pantry. His voice drifting down the hallway where Marcus used to practice conference calls for work, pacing slowly with his sleeves rolled up. The sound of that other man speaking in my son's space felt wrong in a way I could not explain without sounding dramatic, so I did not try. I have lived long enough to know that outrage rarely restores dignity. Silence does. Emily moved through the house with a new energy, opening windows that had stayed shut since the funeral, rearranging throw pillows, replacing the white lilies on the console table with bright yellow tulips, as if grief were a stain that could be scrubbed out with fresh air and color. One morning, I found the box of sympathy cards missing from the coffee table. She had tucked them into a drawer in the sideboard. It is healthier this way, she said when I asked. We cannot live in the past. I looked at her carefully. The past was my son. The past was the 30 hours I labored to bring him into this world in a county hospital with cracked tile floors and one tired nurse who kept calling me honey. The past was the mortgage payments his father and I made every month for 29 years so Marcus could grow up in a stable home with a backyard big enough for a 10-foot basketball hoop. You do not sweep that away in 3 weeks. But I did not argue. Instead, I began to observe. Ryan was polite to me. Too polite. He called me ma'am and offered to carry groceries from my car, even though I have carried my own groceries for decades without assistance. He complimented the framed photographs in the hallway. Marcus seemed like a great man, he said once, pausing in front of the picture from our trip to Charleston 5 summers ago, when the sun had darkened all our skin and Marcus had insisted on taking 100 pictures of me because he said I looked happy. I studied Ryan's reflection in the glass of that frame. He was not cruel. He was not mocking. He was simply stepping into an opening someone else had created. Emily, however, had begun to draw invisible lines inside the house. She started referring to the guest bedroom where I slept as your room instead of the spare room. She spoke about renovations in the kitchen as if I were a temporary tenant whose preferences were sentimental but irrelevant. One evening I overheard her on the phone in the den. Yes, she said softly. It will be easier once everything is settled. I just need her to cooperate. Cooperate. I stood in the hallway, my hand resting against the wall Marcus painted a warm gray 2 years ago because Emily said it was more modern. I remembered the conversation at this very spot, the night Marcus came home from his doctor's appointment with that quiet look in his eyes. He had not wanted to alarm her yet. He had sat beside me at the kitchen table long after she went to bed and told me there were things I needed to understand about the paperwork, about the deed, about provisions he had added for protection. Just in case, he had said. At the time I told him not to talk like that. Now those words returned to me with the clarity of a bell. I went to my room that night and opened the cedar chest at the foot of the bed. Beneath old quilts and photo albums, inside a plain manila envelope, was a copy of the documents Marcus had insisted I keep. I ran my fingers over the embossed seal from the county clerk's office. The paper felt heavier than I remembered. Down the hall, I heard Emily laughing at something Ryan had said, the sound bright and unburdened. She believed I was shrinking. She believed I would adjust, soften, fade into the background like an outdated portrait left hanging out of politeness. She did not know that I was reading every line carefully now, that I was measuring my next steps in inches, not miles, and that patience has always been my strongest habit. The next shift did not happen loudly. It happened quietly, the way real displacement always does, one small adjustment at a time until you realize the ground beneath you is no longer yours. It began with a lock. I came back from my morning walk, the same 2-mile loop I have taken for years through our subdivision, and found that the knob on Marcus's old home office had been replaced. The brushed nickel handle was gone, swapped for a darker bronze one that did not match the rest of the hallway. I stood there for a moment, staring at it as if it might explain itself. That room had always been open. Even after he passed, I would sometimes step inside just to sit in the leather chair behind his desk and rest my hands on the smooth oak surface he saved up 3 months to buy. I did not need to go through his papers. I only needed to feel close to him. When Emily came down the stairs, dressed for work in a fitted blazer and heels that clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, I asked her about it. I kept my voice calm. Why was the lock changed? She adjusted her purse on her shoulder and did not meet my eyes. Ryan is working remotely this week, she said. He needs privacy for his calls. Privacy? In my son's office. I nodded slowly. And the key? I asked. She hesitated just long enough to make her answer clear before she spoke it. It is easier if we limit access. There are sensitive documents in there. Sensitive. I almost smiled at that. Marcus never hid documents from me. He was meticulous. Yes, organized down to labeled folders and digital backups. But he did not believe in secrets inside his own home. Still, I did not challenge her. I simply watched as she walked out the front door and drove away in the car Marcus helped her finance 3 years ago. That afternoon I noticed something else. The framed wedding photo that used to sit on the piano was gone. In its place stood a small ceramic vase with fresh greenery. Not flowers. Just leaves. Clean. Neutral. As if history had been edited for aesthetic reasons. I opened the piano bench and found the photograph carefully wrapped in tissue paper. Not thrown away, just removed from view. I ran my fingers across Marcus's smiling face in that picture, the way his arm curved around Emily's waist, the pride in his posture. He believed in permanence. He believed marriage meant building something that lasted. I wondered what he would think now. Later that evening, I heard Ryan's voice through the new door, low and steady as he spoke during a conference call. I caught phrases like quarterly projections and client deliverables. Professional language filling a room that once held my son's laughter. I stood outside the door long enough to remind myself that anger would only cloud what I needed to see clearly. This was not about emotion. This was about positioning. Emily was not simply moving on. She was restructuring. The kitchen drawers were reorganized. Utility bills were redirected to her email. A new folder appeared. On the counter labeled home improvements. I opened it while she was upstairs and scanned the estimates. Paint, flooring, kitchen island expansion. Large numbers printed in bold at the bottom of each page. She was planning as if the foundation beneath her were unquestionable. That night, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, I asked a simple question. Have you spoken to the attorney about finalizing everything? She looked up quickly. What do you mean? I took a sip of water before answering. About Marcus's estate. Her jaw tightened, just slightly. That is handled, she said. There is nothing to worry about. I held her gaze for several seconds longer than was comfortable. Good, I replied softly. I am glad to hear that. She mistook my calm for compliance again. She thought I was an old woman overwhelmed by paperwork and sorrow. She did not know that I had already scheduled an appointment with Mr. Henderson, the same attorney Marcus consulted last year. The appointment was set for Thursday at 10 in the morning. I wrote it down in my planner with a steady hand. There is a difference between being pushed aside and stepping back to gain perspective. Emily believed she was closing doors behind me. What she did not realize was that some doors are protected by signatures she has never seen and conditions she has never considered. And I intended to review every single one of them. Thursday morning arrived clear and cold, the kind of crisp southern air that makes everything look sharper than it feels. I left the house at 9:30, telling Emily I had a doctor appointment. She barely looked up from her phone. Ryan was already inside the office with the new lock, his voice drifting faintly through the door. I drove myself to Mr. Henderson's office downtown, the same brick building with the brass directory in the lobby that Marcus once joked looked older than the Constitution. I parked in a metered space, fed it enough quarters for 2 hours, and sat in the car for a full minute before going in. I was not afraid. I simply wanted my breathing steady. Inside, the receptionist recognized my last name immediately. Mrs. Thompson, we are very sorry for your loss, she said gently. I thanked her and took a seat beneath a framed photograph of the city skyline, taken at sunset. When Mr. Henderson stepped out to greet me, he held my hand in both of his. Gloria, he said softly, Marcus spoke highly of you. That nearly broke something inside me, but I kept my composure. In his office, the air smelled faintly of paper and coffee. He pulled a file from a locked cabinet and laid it on the desk between us. My son's name was printed neatly across the tab. Seeing it there, official and final, felt heavier than the headstone at the cemetery. Before he passed, Mr. Henderson began. Marcus made several adjustments to his estate plan. He wanted to ensure stability for you. Stability. Not charity. Not temporary kindness. Stability. He opened the file and turned it toward me. The deed to the house was structured with a survivorship clause, but not in the way Emily likely assumed. Marcus had transferred his share into a trust 6 months before his diagnosis became serious. The trust named me as a lifetime beneficiary with residential rights that could not be revoked without my written consent. I listened carefully, asking him to repeat certain phrases so I could understand every word. So she cannot sell the property without my agreement? I asked. Correct, he replied. And if she attempts to refinance or significantly alter the property using it as collateral, the trust terms require notification and approval. I felt something settle inside my chest. Not triumph. Not yet. But balance. Marcus had known. He had anticipated pressure. There is also an occupancy condition, Mr. Henderson continued. If the home environment becomes legally or financially compromised, you have the right to petition for enforcement. I folded my hands in my lap and thought about the new lock on the office door, the renovation folder on the kitchen counter, the quiet phone call about needing me to cooperate. Emily believed paperwork was already handled. She believed grief had distracted me from details. I thanked Mr. Henderson and requested certified copies of everything. When I stepped back outside into the sunlight, the city noise sounded distant, almost irrelevant. I sat in my car again, this time allowing myself a long exhale. Marcus's voice echoed in my memory from that late night at the kitchen table. "Mama, promise me you will not let anyone push you out." I had told him not to speak as if he were leaving. Now, I understood why he insisted. I drove home slowly, watching the familiar streets pass by. The grocery store where Marcus worked part-time in high school. The park where he used to run laps every Saturday morning. Every mile reminded me that this house was not just square footage and market value. It was history layered year after year. When I pulled into the driveway, Ryan's car was there again. I noticed he had parked slightly closer to the garage than usual, as if inching into permanence. I walked inside with the envelope tucked securely in my handbag. Emily was at the kitchen island reviewing paint samples spread across the granite countertop. "How was your appointment?" she asked casually. I set my purse down and looked at the swatches in front of her. Soft gray, pale blue, something called modern sand. "Informative," I said evenly. She smiled without suspicion. "Good. I'm trying to lighten things up around here." I met her eyes, calm and steady. "That depends," I replied quietly, "on who has the authority to make changes." She paused, just for a second, then laughed as if I had made a small joke. But I did not laugh. I did not need to. I had the documents now, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt the ground beneath my feet solid again. The shift from quiet tension to open presumption happened the following Sunday afternoon, when Emily announced that Ryan would be staying for dinner permanently, not as a guest, but as someone who needed space to settle. I was slicing green beans at the counter when she said it, her tone casual, as if she were informing me about a change in the weather. "He will be here more often," she added, arranging 3 place settings instead of 2. I noticed she had moved Marcus's old wooden chair from the head of the table to the corner near the china cabinet. Ryan now sat at the head, comfortably, like a man testing out ownership. I carried the serving dish to the table without comment. The rhythm of my movements was deliberate. Plate, napkin, glass. I have learned that composure unsettles people more than confrontation. During dinner, Ryan spoke about long-term plans. He mentioned the housing market, interest rates, and how this neighborhood had appreciated nearly 12% over the past 3 years. He said it with admiration, but also calculation. "It is a solid asset," he remarked, glancing around the dining room. Emily nodded. "We could really transform it," she said. "Open concept. Maybe knock down that wall between the kitchen and living room." That wall held the height Marcus measured every birthday from age 5 until he left for college. Pencil lines, dates, small notes like grew 2 inches this year. I kept my eyes on my plate. "Structural changes require planning," I said evenly. Emily sighed softly, the way younger people do when they believe patience is outdated. "Gloria, the house needs to evolve. We cannot freeze it in time." Freeze. As if preserving memory were a flaw. After dinner, Ryan remained at the table scrolling through listings on his tablet. I passed behind him and saw the words refinance options displayed across the screen. He did not try to hide it. That was the bold part. They believed momentum was on their side. Later that evening, I heard them talking in the kitchen while I was upstairs. Emily's voice carried clearly through the air vent. "Once everything is consolidated, it will make more sense financially," she said. "And she cannot object forever. She cannot object forever." I stood very still in my bedroom, the envelope from Mr. Henderson resting on the dresser beside me. I thought about the occupancy condition again. I thought about the clause requiring notification for any structural or financial alteration. The next morning, I rose early and made coffee before either of them woke. I sat at the kitchen table with my planner open and began writing down dates. The day the lock was changed. The day renovation estimates appeared. The day refinance options were mentioned openly at dinner. Documentation is not emotional. It is factual. At 8:30, Emily came downstairs and looked surprised to see me already dressed. "You are up early," she said. I closed my planner gently. "I have always been an early riser," I replied. Ryan entered shortly after, offering a polite good morning. He poured himself coffee from the pot I had brewed and thanked me. I watched him carefully. He was not malicious, but he was comfortable. Too comfortable. I would like the key to Marcus's office, I said calmly, addressing Emily. She stiffened. Why? Because my name is attached to this property, I answered. And I do not believe in locked doors inside my own home. Ryan looked between us, uncertain. Emily's expression hardened slightly. We need boundaries, she said. I met her gaze without raising my voice. Boundaries are written into legal documents, I replied. Not decided over breakfast. Silence settled over the kitchen, heavier than the steam rising from our cups. She studied my face, searching for hesitation. She did not find it. For the first time since the funeral, she seemed unsure of her footing. That was when I realized something important. They had been moving quickly because they assumed I would move slowly. They mistook age for weakness. They confused grief with surrender. But I had the paperwork. I had the dates. And now, I had their assumptions laid out plainly in front of me. The next step would not require raised voices. It would require timing. And I have always understood the value of waiting until the right moment to speak. The tension that had been hovering quietly in the air finally found its voice 2 nights later. It was close to 9 in the evening when Emily asked me to sit down at the kitchen table. Ryan was there too, standing by the counter with his arms crossed, not aggressive but aligned. I recognized the posture. This was not casual conversation. This was coordination. I took my usual seat, the one beside the window that looks out onto the backyard where Marcus learned to ride his bicycle at age 6. Emily folded her hands together as if she were about to deliver compassionate news. Gloria, she began carefully, we need to talk about long-term arrangements. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence stretch just enough for her to continue. This situation is not sustainable, she said. Ryan and I are trying to build something stable. We cannot do that with constant resistance. Resistance? I had not raised my voice once. I had not blocked a doorway. I had only asked questions. What exactly do you believe I am resisting? I asked calmly. She exhaled, frustrated that I was not meeting her emotion with emotion. You question every change. You make it clear that this house is yours as much as mine. I held her gaze. It is. The word landed heavier than she expected. Ryan shifted slightly, but remained silent. Emily leaned forward. Marcus is gone. I am his widow. I have the right to move forward, to make decisions, to invite someone into my life without feeling judged in my own home. There it was. Not grief. Not confusion. Ownership. I nodded once. No one is stopping you from moving forward, I said. But forward does not mean erasing what existed before you. Her expression hardened. You cannot control what happens here forever. I reached into the folder I had placed beside my chair earlier that evening. I did not slam it down. I simply laid it flat on the table and turned it toward her. I do not need to control anything, I replied evenly. I only need to understand the terms. She looked at the documents, but did not touch them. Ryan stepped closer, curiosity overtaking caution. What is that? He asked. Copies of the trust agreement, I said. Signed and notarized. Emily's face changed then, not dramatically, but enough. The confidence dimmed slightly around the edges. Why are you bringing that up? She asked. I met her eyes steadily. Because structural renovations, refinancing discussions, and occupancy adjustments fall under specific conditions. Ryan's jaw tightened. We were only exploring options, he said quickly. Exploration requires transparency, I answered, especially when more than one legal party is involved. Emily pushed her chair back abruptly, the legs scraping against the hardwood floor. This is ridiculous, she said. You are making this harder than it needs to be. I remained seated. No, I said quietly. I am making it clearer. The room felt smaller in that moment, not physically, but emotionally. She had expected confrontation, perhaps tears, maybe even anger she could dismiss as generational stubbornness. What she received instead was documentation. Ryan picked up one of the pages and scanned it quickly. His eyes slowed as he read further. Emily, he murmured, low enough that he likely thought I would not catch it. Did you know about this clause? She did not answer him. Instead, she looked directly at me. You went behind my back. I almost smiled at that. I consulted the same attorney Marcus trusted. I replied. There is nothing behind your back about that. The silence that followed was different from the ones before. This one carried calculation. Emily straightened her posture and gathered herself. Fine, she said finally. If you want to involve lawyers in every decision, then we will. I closed the folder gently. I do not want conflict, I said. I want respect. Ryan placed the document back on the table as if it had weight he had not anticipated. For the first time since he entered this house, he looked uncertain about his footing. And in that uncertainty, I saw the shift. The momentum they believed belonged to them had slowed. Not because I shouted, not because I threatened, but because I understood something they had underestimated. This home was not simply memory. It was protected, and so was I. The house grew quieter after that conversation, but it was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of recalculation. The next morning, Emily did not mention the documents. She moved through the kitchen with controlled politeness, pouring coffee, checking her phone, avoiding my eyes just long enough to signal that something had shifted. Ryan left earlier than usual, offering a brief nod in my direction before stepping out the door. I watched from the window as he backed his car down the driveway more slowly than he had in previous days. Momentum had been interrupted. That afternoon, I received an email from Mr. Henderson confirming that formal notice could be issued if any unauthorized financial steps were attempted regarding the property. I printed the message and placed it inside the same folder. Documentation has a way of strengthening resolve. 2 days later, the real test came. A real estate agent's business card appeared on the kitchen counter beside a stack of paint samples. It was subtle, placed half beneath a magazine as if it had slipped there accidentally. I picked it up and read the name. I recognized the agency. They specialized in upscale renovations and resale. When Emily came home, I held the card between my fingers without speaking. She froze for just a fraction of a second before composing herself. "We were only gathering information," she said quickly. "There is nothing wrong with exploring options." I nodded once. "Exploration requires consent when the asset is shared," I replied evenly. She pressed her lips together, frustration flashing across her face. "You are making this impossible," she said. I shook my head gently. "No, I am making it structured." That evening, I called Mr. Henderson and asked him to draft a formal letter reminding all parties of the trust conditions. I did not threaten. I did not accuse. I simply ensured clarity. The letter was sent certified mail the following morning. When it arrived 3 days later, Emily opened it at the dining table while I prepared dinner. I heard the paper unfold. I heard the silence that followed. "You involved the attorney again," she said, her voice lower now. "Yes," I answered. "Because the house is not a casual investment. It is protected." Ryan stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. His expression changed from irritation to something closer to caution. "We did not realize the limitations were this specific," he admitted quietly. Emily turned toward him sharply, but she did not argue. That was when I understood the dynamic more clearly. He had assumed she had full authority. She had assumed I would not verify. Assumptions are expensive when they meet paperwork. The following week, small reversals began to appear. The renovation folder disappeared from the counter. The real estate business card was gone. The lock on the office door remained. But one evening Emily handed me a duplicate key without comment. I accepted it without thanking her. Gratitude was not the point. Recognition was. One night after dinner, Ryan spoke directly to me for the first time about the situation. "I never intended to create tension," he said, his tone measured. "I care about Emily. I only wanted stability." I met his gaze calmly. "Stability requires transparency," I replied, "and respect for what existed before you arrived." He nodded slowly, absorbing that. Emily remained silent beside him, her posture rigid. The air between us was different now. Not warm, not friendly, but balanced. They had tested the boundaries and found them solid. And I realized something important in that moment. I did not need to remove anyone from this house. I only needed to ensure that no one removed me. Marcus had anticipated this. He had protected the foundation quietly, without drama, without confrontation. I was simply honoring what he had built. The shift was no longer about whether I would stay silent. It was about whether they would learn to coexist within limits they had not expected. And for the first time since grief entered these walls, I felt something steady again. Not victory, not satisfaction, but control restored through patience. Control does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it returns in small, deliberate gestures that force everyone in the room to adjust. A week after the letter arrived, I decided it was time to reestablish something that had been quietly displaced. Saturday morning, I rose before sunrise and prepared breakfast the way I used to when Marcus was alive. Scrambled eggs with sharp cheddar, turkey bacon, buttered toast, and fresh sliced oranges arranged neatly on a platter. I set the table fully, including the wooden chair that had been moved aside. I placed it back at the head of the table, not as a memorial, as a reminder. When Emily came downstairs, she paused at the sight. "We do not usually do full breakfast on Saturdays," she said carefully. I poured coffee into 3 cups without responding to the comment. "We do today," I replied. Ryan entered shortly after, drawn by the smell. He looked at the table, then at the restored chair. He understood the symbolism immediately. He hesitated only a second before taking the seat to the right, not at the head. That small decision did not go unnoticed. We ate in near silence at first. The clink of silverware against plates sounded louder than usual. After a few minutes, I spoke calmly. "I will be hosting Sunday dinner next week," I said. Emily looked up quickly. "Hosting," she repeated. "Yes," I answered. "Family. A few church friends. People who have known this home for decades." She set her fork down. "You did not ask." I met her eyes evenly. "I am informing you." Ryan shifted in his seat, sensing the tightening air. "That might be a lot right now," Emily said, her tone measured but strained. "We are still adjusting." I folded my napkin and placed it beside my plate. "Adjustment does not require isolation," I replied. "This house has always been open to community." The word community lingered between us. Emily had been trying to narrow the space, to redefine it as a private new beginning. I was widening it again. That afternoon, I began preparing. I polished the silver tray that had belonged to my mother. I retrieved the framed wedding photo from the piano bench and placed it back on display. I walked through each room slowly, opening curtains, letting light settle into corners that had felt dim for weeks. Ryan watched from the living room as I moved with steady purpose. "You seem very certain," he said quietly. I paused and faced him. "Certainty comes from understanding what is secure," I replied. He nodded, absorbing more than just the words. By Sunday evening, the house felt different. Not because of confrontation, but because of presence. Laughter returned, soft and genuine. Mrs. Caldwell from church hugged me tightly in the foyer. Old family friends admired the backyard, recalling Marcus's graduation party years ago. Emily moved among the guests politely, but she was no longer directing the atmosphere. She was participating in something she could not fully control. Ryan remained courteous, offering drinks, listening more than speaking. I noticed he was careful about where he stood, careful not to appear as if he were claiming space that did not belong to him. When the evening ended and the last guest departed, the air felt balanced again. Emily closed the door and turned toward me. There was frustration in her eyes, but also realization. "You are not going anywhere," she said quietly. It was not a question. I held her gaze calmly. "No," I answered. "I am not." She studied my face for signs of defiance or triumph. She found neither. What she found instead was steadiness, the kind that does not need volume to prove itself. In the weeks that followed, the house stopped feeling like a battlefield and started feeling like a shared space with defined boundaries. The key to the office remained accessible to me. The renovation plans did not resurface. Conversations about refinancing disappeared. I did not remove anyone. I did not demand apologies. I simply occupied my place fully. And in doing so, I reminded them that stability is not built by pushing someone out. It is built by recognizing who has been standing there all along. The weeks after that dinner settled into a rhythm that felt almost ordinary on the surface, but beneath it there was a quiet recalibration happening in every room. Emily stopped making sudden announcements. Ryan no longer spoke about market trends at the table. The house breathed differently, as if it had been holding tension in its walls and could finally release it inch by inch. One evening, about a month after the letter from the attorney, I found Emily sitting alone at the kitchen island long after Ryan had gone home. The lights were dim, and she was staring at her phone without scrolling. I poured myself a glass of water and sat across from her. For a moment neither of us spoke. The refrigerator hummed softly behind us. "Did you ever plan to leave?" she asked suddenly, her voice quieter than I had heard it in weeks. I considered the question carefully. "No," I said. "This is my home." She nodded slowly, absorbing that as if she were hearing it for the first time instead of the 100th. "I thought you would," she admitted. "After everything. Everything. Loss. Grief. Change. Why would I abandon the place where my son lived his life?" I asked gently. She pressed her lips together, and for once there was no defensiveness in her expression, only uncertainty. I did not know how to move forward with you still here, she said. It felt like I was being watched. I held her gaze without accusation. You were not being watched, I replied. You were being witnessed. That word seemed to land differently. She leaned back in her chair. Ryan thought we needed a fresh start, she said. New space. New energy. I nodded. Fresh starts do not require erasing foundations, I answered. They require understanding them. She was quiet again after that. The next morning, something small but significant happened. The framed wedding photograph remained on the piano. She did not move it. Later that week, I walked past Marcus's office and noticed the door was open. Not wide, just enough to signal that it was no longer guarded territory. Ryan was inside finishing a call. When he saw me, he gestured politely for me to come in. I stepped into the room slowly, taking in the familiar scent of wood polish and paper. Marcus's desk remained intact. The photographs on the shelf had not been disturbed. I wanted to say something, Ryan said once he ended the call. His tone was steady, not defensive. I stepped into this house without fully understanding what it meant to you. I listened without interrupting. I assumed grief meant vacancy, he continued. I was wrong. I studied his face carefully. There was no arrogance in it now, only awareness. Assumptions are easy when you are young, I said quietly. But homes are not just structures. They are timelines. He nodded. I respect that. That word again. Respect. It had taken paperwork, patience, and presence to restore it. Emily joined us in the doorway a moment later. She did not speak, but her posture had changed. The sharp edges had softened, not because she had surrendered, but because she had recalculated what was possible. The conversation that followed was not dramatic. There were no apologies offered in grand gestures. There were no ultimatums. Instead, there were boundaries acknowledged out loud. No financial decisions without joint agreement. No structural changes without consultation. No closed doors without reason. It was not reconciliation in the sentimental sense. It was alignment. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, I looked around at the walls Marcus had painted, the floors he refinished, the backyard he once mowed in straight, careful lines. I realized something important. I had not fought to remove anyone. I had not needed to raise my voice. I had simply remained steady long enough for truth to surface. They expected silence to mean surrender. They expected age to mean fragility. Instead, they learned that patience can be stronger than force, and documentation can speak louder than argument. The house remained standing, not because I defended it loudly, but because I understood its foundation. And in that understanding, I found my place secured exactly where it had always been. The understanding we reached did not transform the house overnight into something warm and effortless. It transformed it into something honest. There is a difference. Honest spaces require maintenance. They require steady reminders of where the lines are drawn. A few weeks after our conversation in Marcus's office, Emily approached me with a folder in her hands. It was late afternoon, sunlight stretching long across the living room floor. I would like to review the household expenses together, she said carefully. The tone was different now. Not confrontational, not dismissive, structured. I nodded and motioned for her to sit. She spread the papers across the coffee table. Utility bills, property taxes, insurance statements. For the first time since Marcus passed, the documents were not presented as decisions already made. They were presented as information to be discussed. Ryan joined us a few minutes later, taking a seat on the armchair instead of positioning himself beside her as reinforcement. We want transparency, he said. The phrasing was deliberate. I studied the numbers quietly, taking my time. Transparency works both ways, I replied. It includes intentions. Emily met my eyes. We are not planning to refinance, she said directly. We understand the conditions now. There was no sarcasm in her voice, only acknowledgment. I inclined my head slightly. Good, I said. Then we moved forward responsibly. That word forward no longer sounded like displacement. It sounded like coexistence. Over the next month, routine settled. Ryan still spent time at the house, but not every night. When he stayed for dinner, he cleared his plate and thanked me without hesitation. The office door remained open more often than closed. Sometimes I would find him working quietly at the desk Marcus once used, careful not to disturb the framed photographs that remained exactly where they had always been. One evening, as I passed by, I saw him straighten one of the frames that had tilted slightly. That small gesture carried more weight than any apology could have. Emily, too, adjusted in ways that were subtle but meaningful. She asked before hosting friends. She consulted me before scheduling contractors for minor repairs. Once, she even requested that I choose the color for new curtains in the living room. I selected a deep navy, the same shade Marcus wore at his graduation. She did not argue. The power dynamic had not vanished. It had balanced. There were still moments of tension. Grief does not dissolve simply because paperwork is clarified, but the tension no longer felt like a threat. It felt like negotiation within defined boundaries. One Sunday afternoon, I sat alone on the back porch with a glass of iced tea, watching the late summer heat shimmer above the grass. Emily joined me quietly. She folded her hands in her lap and stared out at the yard. "I did not know how strong you were," she said after a long silence. I considered that carefully. "Strength is not loud," I replied. "It is consistent." She nodded slowly. "I thought silence meant you were giving up." I shook my head gently. "Silence can also mean someone is thinking." She let out a small breath, almost a laugh. Not mocking, relieved. "Marcus always said you were the steady one," she murmured. Hearing his name spoken without tension felt different now. Softer. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. I realized in that moment that the true shift had not been legal. It had been perceptual. They no longer saw me as an obstacle to their future. They saw me as part of the structure that made the future possible. The house remained exactly where it had stood for decades, but its atmosphere had matured. It was no longer a battleground of assumption. It was a place where boundaries had been tested and proven. And as I rose from the porch chair and walked back inside, I felt something I had not felt since before the funeral. Not triumph. Not vindication. Stability. The kind that does not need to announce itself because it is already understood. Autumn arrived slowly that year, the air turning cooler in the evenings, the leaves in the backyard shifting from green to deep shades of amber and rust. With the change in season came a quiet clarity inside the house. It had been months since the tension first surfaced, and now the rhythm of daily life felt measured rather than fragile. Emily began spending some weekends at Ryan's apartment across town, not in secrecy, not in defiance, but as part of a life that no longer required reshaping this one. She informed me ahead of time, sometimes even asking if I needed anything from the grocery store before she left. The tone had changed. There was no more testing of boundaries, only acknowledgment of them. One evening, as we sat at the dining table reviewing the annual property tax notice, Emily looked at me differently, not as opposition, not as authority, but as continuity. "I have been thinking," she said slowly, tracing her finger along the edge of the paper. "Maybe it is better if this house remains exactly what it has always been." I did not respond immediately. I let her complete the thought. "Marcus loved it here," she continued. "And you built it with him. I do not need to change it to move forward." That was the first time she spoke of forward without implying replacement. I folded the notice neatly and set it aside. "Homes do not compete with new beginnings," I said quietly. "They support them." She nodded, absorbing that without resistance. A week later, she made another decision. She chose not to pursue any financial restructuring. No refinancing. No equity loans. She said she wanted simplicity. Stability. Words that once belonged to me alone now existed between us. Ryan visited less frequently, but more intentionally. When he did come by, he brought small gestures rather than plans. A bouquet of flowers for the kitchen counter. A new set of light bulbs. For the porch fixture that had been flickering. He no longer spoke about investment value. He spoke about comfort. One afternoon, I found him in the backyard examining the fence Marcus installed 15 years ago. "It still stands straight," he said thoughtfully. He did solid work. I joined him at the edge of the grass, looking at the fence line stretching clean and steady across the property. "He learned that from his father," I replied. Ryan nodded. "I can see that." That acknowledgment felt genuine, not strategic. The most significant shift came quietly one evening when Emily brought out a small storage box from the hallway closet. Inside were Marcus's personal items she had kept aside. His watch, his college diploma, a few handwritten notes. She placed the box on the coffee table between us. "These belong where they are respected," she said softly. I opened the box slowly, running my fingers over the familiar objects. There was no urgency in the gesture. No performance. Only shared understanding. They will remain here, I said. Always. She exhaled, as if releasing something she had been holding for a long time. In that moment, I realized the true resolution had never been about ownership alone. It had been about acknowledgment. She had feared being overshadowed by memory. I had feared being erased by momentum. Now neither fear held power. The house remained unchanged in structure, but it felt different in spirit. Not divided, not contested, anchored. I no longer kept a planner filled with dates and documentation. The folder of legal copies remained in my drawer, untouched but secure. I did not need to display it anymore. The boundaries had been internalized. One cool evening, as I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, I paused in the hallway outside Marcus's office. The door stood open. Inside, the desk was orderly. The photographs aligned. The air calm. I understood then that stability does not come from winning a confrontation. It comes from standing firmly enough that others recognize the ground beneath you. And in this house, the ground had never shifted. It had only been tested. Now it stood steady again, not because someone left, but because everyone finally understood where they stood. Winter settled over the house gently that year, not with harsh storms, but with quiet mornings where frost traced delicate patterns along the edges of the windows. On the anniversary of Marcus's passing, I woke before dawn and walked through each room slowly, the way I used to check on him when he was a boy sleeping down the hall. The floors were cool beneath my feet. The air was still. I paused in the kitchen, resting my hand on the same counter where months ago I had stood gripping a dish towel while unfamiliar shoes waited by the door. That memory no longer burned. It felt distant now, like a lesson already learned. Emily came downstairs just after sunrise. She wore a simple dark sweater, her expression softer than I had seen it in a long time. I thought we could visit the cemetery together, she said quietly. I studied her face for tension, for performance. I found none. Only sincerity. I would like that, I answered. We drove separately but arrived within minutes of each other. The cemetery was calm, the grass trimmed neatly, small American flags marking nearby veterans' graves. We stood side by side before Marcus's headstone. No speeches, no dramatic gestures, just silence and presence. After a while, Emily reached into her bag and placed a small bouquet of white lilies at the base of the stone. He loved these, she said. I nodded. He did. The wind moved gently through the trees, carrying the faint scent of winter air. I felt something settle inside me then, something complete. On the drive back, I realized that the conflict that once threatened to fracture this home had transformed into understanding. Not perfect harmony, not constant agreement, but recognition. Later that afternoon, Ryan stopped by with a small wooden plaque he had crafted himself. It was simple, polished smooth, with one sentence carved carefully into the surface. Family is built on respect. He handed it to me without ceremony. I thought this belonged here, he said. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It was not an apology. It was acknowledgment. I placed it on the entryway table beneath Marcus's photograph. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow through the living room windows, the three of us shared dinner quietly. There was no tension at the table, no strategic positioning, just conversation about work, about church events, about the coming holidays. At one point, Emily looked around the room and smiled faintly. It feels steady here, she said. I met her eyes and nodded. It always has been, I replied. The steadiness had never disappeared. It had only been tested by assumption and impatience. As night fell, I walked down the hallway one last time before bed. Marcus's office door stood open, the desk orderly, the photographs upright. I touched the edge of the doorframe lightly. I remembered the fear I once felt that silence would be mistaken for surrender. Instead, silence had become my strength. Patience had become my voice. And documentation had become my shield. I did not have to force anyone out. I did not have to fight loudly. I only had to remain. The house remained too. Its walls still held laughter from years past. Its floors still carried the imprint of footsteps that shaped my life. And now, instead of tension, it held something stronger. Mutual respect. As I turned off the lights and prepared for sleep, I understood that closure is not about reclaiming what was nearly lost. It is about realizing it was never truly gone. I had been asked, without words, to shrink, to fade, to make room by disappearing. Instead, I stood firm. Not with anger, not with bitterness, but with certainty. And in that certainty, everything aligned. The home my husband and I built, the son we raised, the legacy he protected, it all remained intact. Not because I demanded it, but because I knew its worth and refused to forget it. And that is how the story ends. Not with someone leaving, not with someone defeated, but with respect restored and the foundation unshaken.